It's a wonderful pleasure to be here in fabled Aspen, a place that has lived in my imagination for many, many years through my partner, who has been here to ski many, many, many times. So it's wonderful to actually see and be part of this community for a few days. What I'd like to share with you tonight is sort of, you know, as most poets, we write in obscurity and we go about our lives and whatnot. And suddenly it's Richard Blanco, first gay, first like this, first Latino, first engineer, first guy from Maine, first guy from Florida, first guy from, it could go on and on and on. So what I'd like to give you tonight is a little bit about that journey to the podium and how that happened. And I think when one looks at one's life retrospectively, you realize that that a lot of things sort of clicked to be able to make something happen. So I'm going to give you sort of a backdrop of my whole sort of life and that road to the podium. A road that literally began with that phone call on December 12th, a day that will live in infamy in my mind. But a journey that began figuratively a long, long time ago, perhaps even before I was born. And Adrian alluded to this. So she put it much more sort of elegantly, but here's the way I like to say it. I was made in Cuba, assembled in Spain, and imported to the United States, much like a commodity. And what happened is my mom left 7 months pregnant from Cuba, and then to Spain, where I was born, and 45 days later we emigrated to the United States. And this is a little recordatorio, as we like to say. I don't know why the Eiffel Tower's in there. It just adds to the confusion that would be Richard Blanco's life. But a side note, I'm just trying to give you these slides not as sort of like, this isn't my engineer PowerPoint presentation. There won't be any graphs or anything like that. It's sort of just a backdrop in a play, if you will, something to echo some of the poems. But in any case, that was sort of an ironic foreshadowing, and if you believe in a higher power, it was saying, Richard, guess what you're going to be obsessed with and write about when you grow up. And that is this whole idea of cultural identity, the whole idea of home and of place and belonging and what that means. By the time I was 45 days old, I belonged to 3 countries. I had lived in 2 world-class cities. My newborn photo, which is there, is actually my green card photo for entry into the United States. Sometimes God can be brilliant, right? Or a comic, as they say. In any case, I want to share that particular story because I think it's important as to what my selection was all about as inaugural poet and what the inaugural poem ended up being about, which is really a very personal poem, even though on the surface it doesn't seem quite that way. And the idea being that even though I'm going to tell you this particular story with these poems, that it's really a universal story. Who amongst us in this audience hasn't asked ourselves, where do I belong? Where am I from? What is paradise? What is home? I know in a place like Aspen, we often move here because we're in search of that paradise, of that utopia, right? So it's really that primordial sort of sense of that's in the DNA of our humanity to sort of find that place that we belong. It was especially pronounced in me at 45 days old. You can tell I was a pretty confused kid by the time I was 2 or 3 years old. So in any case, I want to share that with you. I also want to share with you an idea about poetry, and this is the way I kind of think about poetry. And it's the same way we can think about movies, or we can think about almost any sort of art form, that the poem is a mirror, right? The poem isn't about me telling you just my story, but the poem is a place where I stand in front of it as a mirror, and you're standing side by side with me. And our lives are blurring, because after all, it's really about what it means to be human, and those primordial questions that we all ask ourselves, those universal questions. Where am I from? Where do I belong? What is home? So in that spirit, I'll begin with a little bit more backdrop. After we immigrated to New York, we eventually moved to a galaxy far, far away, where the journey really began, known as Miami, which is quite different from Aspen. And I don't know what my dad was thinking about with that Speedo, but he was kind of sexy. I don't know. For the 70s, that is, I guess. What happened growing up as a child of exiles in Miami, and Miami is a weird enough place today, imagine 1972. I grew up between two imaginary worlds. One was the 1950s and 60s Cuba of my parents and my grandparents, and the stories that were on their minds, the letters that were still coming in, the gossip, everything else, this wonderful paradise that we were going back to someday, this world that we belonged to, yet I had never been there. And the other less obvious sort of imaginary world that I had to deal with was America. Because I grew up in a very undiverse community. I grew up in a community that was all Cuban. The grocer was Cuban, most of my classmates were Cuban, the doctor was Cuban, the mayor was Cuban, so it was stratified across the board, it was Cuban. And so I grew up conceptualizing America through what I saw on TV. I mean, that was basically, I really thought an America existed like that. There was some faraway place, or not too far away, and Miami was kind of a cultural purgatory, as I like to call it. It was a waiting ground between the real imagined Cuba that I would go to maybe someday and the real imagined America that I was dying to get to someday. And the real that's me in the middle if you haven't figured it out, but the real sort of cornerstone for that was the Brady Bunch. I was convinced that someday we would live like that. And so growing up in between those two worlds, navigating those two worlds, those two imaginary worlds, where am I from, where do I belong, what is home, how do I get there, what does that look or feel like, became a really important part of my work early on since the first book. And that's where this poem comes from, which deals with something that's always been sort of a tragic, comic, conflict in my life, which is my name. So here you'll see little Ricky sort of trying to navigate between those two worlds. Whimsical poem. The name I wanted. Not Ricardo, but Richard. Because I felt like Richard Burton, a true Anglo-Saxon in tights reciting Othello. Because I wanted to be as handsome as Richard Gere in a white tuxedo. Because I had a pinky ring just like Richard Dawson on Family Feud. Because I knew I could be just as wholesome as Richie Cunningham, just as American as my father's favorite president, Nixon. Richard, not Ricardo, not my nicknames either. El Negrito, little black boy for my skin the color of dried tobacco when I was born. Or El Galleguito, the little Galician, because that's what Tio Noelia called anyone like me, born in Spain, not really 100% Cuban. And not Rico, the name Lupe wrote on my desk, branding me as Barry Manilow's Latin lover in ruffled sleeves dancing copa at the Copacabana, all of 8th grade. And definitely not Ricardito, little Ricky, worse than Dick. Richard, descendant of British royals, not the shepherds of my mother's family, not the plantain farmers on my father's side. Richard, name of German composers, not the swish of machetes, rapping of bongos. Richard, more elegant than my grandfather in his polyester suit with chiclets jingling in his pockets, more refined than my grandmother gnawing mangoes, passing gas at this kitchen sink. Ricardo de Jesus Blanco. I dub thee myself Sir Richard Jesus White. defender of my own country, protector of my wishes, conqueror of mirrors, sovereign of my imagination, a name for my name. Thank you. So this is a Brady Bunch family night on the left there. With you all remember that episode? Yeah. And this is a typical family night at the Blanco. So it's the Blanco Bunch versus the Brady Bunch. One of those family nights that keeps on living in my memory, and something that even came. This poem is from the third book, and just when you thought you were over those weird, bizarre memories, it's like this Cuban PTSD, and you're like, what were we doing? And one of those family nights was the Miss America pageant, which was like a ritual in our house. And I had to go back to that in this third book because I had to try to understand what the hell was going on. And part of what you'll see is here again that navigation of little Ricky trying to figure out what the hell is going on here. You know, what is America? Where am I living? What's really going on? Am I Cuban? Am I American? Am I both? Am I neither? And so this is another sort of whimsical, at the risk of sounding like a stand-up comedian, another whimsical poem for you. It's called Betting on America. My grandmother was the bookie, set up at the kitchen table that night, her hair in curlers, pencil and pad, jotting down $2 bets, paying 5-1 on which miss would take the crown that year. Abuelo put all his money on Miss Wyoming. She's got great teeth, he pronounced, as if complimenting a horse, not her smile feeling the camera before she whisked away like a cloud in her creamy chiffon dress. I dug up enough change from the sofa and car seats to bet on Miss Wisconsin, thinking I was as American as she because I was as blonde as she was, and I knew that's where all the cheese came from. And that wasn't all. All the chocolate was from Miss Pennsylvania. The capital of Miss Montana was Helena. Mount Rushmore was in Miss South Dakota, and I knew exactly how to say Miss Connecticut. Unlike my tia Gloria, who just pointed at the TV, esa, that one, claiming she had her same figure before leaving Cuba. Es verdad? It's true. I have pictures, she declared before cramming another bocadito sandwich into her mouth. Papa refused to bet on any of the misses because Americanas all have skinny butts, he complained. There's nothing like a big culo cubano. And everyone agreed. Es verdad. Except for me and my little cousin Julito, who apparently was a breast man at age 5. Reaching from Miss Alabama's bosom on the screen, the leggy mulata sashaying in pumps and swimsuit, seducing Tio Pedro into picking her as the sure winner. She's the one. She looks Cubana, he swore. And she did, but she cost him $5. Cojone, he exploded as confetti rained down. Bert Parks leading Miss Ohio, the new Miss America, by the hand to the runway. Gloves up to her elbows, velvet down to her feet, crying diamonds into her bouquet, the queen of our country, of our land of the free, amid the purple mountains of her majesty, floating across the stage and our living room, though no one bet on her. And none of us, not even me, could answer Mama when she asked us, Chico, ¿dónde? Where is Ohio? Thank you. So that's my mama at the inauguration. My mother, the question of where I'm from, where I belong, this whole question of cultural identity, of cultural loyalty, of national loyalty, is something that keeps on coloring my life throughout adulthood. I mean, those two poems are obviously from childhood or flashbacks into childhood, but that question is something that I still live with in some ways today. And that question was especially poignant when it came to my mother. My mother left Cuba, left every single family member, every single relative. And you know that for a Latino family, that means neighbors. That means a lot of people. And for years, she figures very prominently in all of my work and all of my books. In fact, she claims that she should get royalties for all the inspiration that I've given her. But I've always connected her story to the sense of loss and of courage. And when I got the assignment for the inaugural poem, I hadn't quite made the connection that my mother is really my connection to America as well, for this reason. Imagine that you had to leave this auditorium today and get on a plane and leave America forever. And I realized that her story is not about courage. Well, it is about courage and loss, but more so, it's about faith. The faith that she had to have in this country to be able to do that. The faith that was nothing more than an ideal. It's the quintessential American dream story, the quintessential immigrant story. And so for the third poem of the three poems I had to write, I focused on her life and her story. And the idea came to me that actually my mother is more of an American than I could ever be. She has more faith in this country than I could ever have in some ways. And it was especially powerful. And so this poem is centered around that idea, around placing yourself in those shoes. It's called Mother Country. To love a country as if you've lost one. 1968. My mother leaves Cuba for America, a scene I imagine over and over again as if standing in her place. 1 foot inside a plane destined for a country she knew only as a name, a color on a map, or glossy photos from drugstore magazines. Her other foot anchored to the platform of her patria, her hand clutched around one suitcase, taking only what she needs most. Hand-colored photographs of her family, her wedding veil, the doorknob of her house, a jar of dirt from her backyard. Goodbye letters she won't open for years. The sorrowful drone of engines, one last deep breath of familiar air she'll take with her. One last glimpse at all she'd ever known. The palm trees wave goodbye as she steps onto the plane. The mountains shrink from her eyes as she lifts into another life. To love a country as if you've lost one. I hear her, once upon a time, reading picture books over my shoulder at bedtime, both of us learning English, sounding out words as strange as the talking animals and fair-haired princesses in their pages. I taste her first attempts at macaroni and cheese, but with chorizo and peppers. And her shame over Thanksgiving turkeys, always dry, but countered by her perfect pork pernil and garlic yuca. I smell the rain of those mornings, huddled as one, under one umbrella, waiting for the bus to her 10-hour days at the cash register. At night, the zzz of her sewing her own blouses and quinceañera dresses for her grown nieces still in Cuba, guessing at their sizes. And the gowns she'd sell to neighbors to save for a rusty white sedan, no hubcaps, no air conditioning, sweating all the way through our first vacation to Florida theme parks. To love a country as if you've lost one, as if it were you on a plane departing from America forever, clouds closing like curtains on your country. The last scene in which you're a madman scribbling the names of your favorite flowers, trees, and birds you'd never see again. Your address and phone number you'd never use again. The color of your father's eyes and your mother's hair, terrified you could somehow forget these. To love a country as if I was my mother last spring, hobbling, insisting I help her climb all the way up to the Capitol, as if she were here before you today instead of me, explaining her tears, cheeks pink as the cherry blossoms, coloring the air that day when she stopped, turned to me and said, "You know, mijo, I've been thinking. It isn't where you're born that matters. It's where you choose to die. That's your country." Thank you. So one of the questions I get asked a lot, and is not so publicized in all this media frenzy, is the engineer part. It's just not sexy, you know. The engineer is like, not that Latino gay, yeah, but like engineer, like, so. But it's really one of the most fascinating questions to me, and one I get asked a lot otherwise. And this poem deals a little bit with that, and about my father. And it's really interesting to me because there's a lot of more overlap than people kind of think, and there's a lot of more interconnection between things. And what I love about poetry and what I love about being a human being is that, you know, you can't compartmentalize your life, right? So you can't be gay for 4 hours a week and Cuban for 6 hours a week and whatever. It all comes together. And part of the reason that I studied engineering, because we were an immigrant working class family. I mean, if I would have said I wanted to study English or poetry, you can imagine what would have happened at the dinner table. You know, the parents wanted, you know, a better life than we had. You're going to study doctor, lawyer, engineer. I chose the lesser of three evils. Sorry for the doctors and the lawyers in the audience, but and there's also another factor in here. It has to do with my sexuality, which I'll bring up in the next poem. But so all of these things sort of combine into making me who I am. But there is overlap in all knowledge. And as an engineer, one of the greatest things, or one of the funnest things I was doing in the last 5 years of my practice, before Obama called, was urban economic redevelopment and urban redevelopment and sort of streetscaping and sort of redefining cities and trying to find out that vision and trying to historically reach out and trying to recreate a city that perhaps needed a little boost. And I realized that what I did as an engineer, which was to sort of manipulate physical landscapes, three-dimensional landscapes, to create a sense of place, to create an emotional response that people would respond to, that sense of creating home, right? So what does that mean? And for some of you older or more residents here, there's been in Aspen, you know, you've probably seen a lot of changes and you have that reaction to like, well, it wasn't like that 20 years ago. But the idea of paying tribute to that. So there's a physical landscape, But as a poet, I understand there's also an emotional landscape, that in a poem, I'm trying to recreate place. I'm trying to understand something perhaps in a virtual space or in a two-dimensional plane and what that means to me as far as home. So this poem works into all of that. It also has to do with my father's relationship with me, and one of the reasons I emotionally studied engineering. And as an engineer, this is my dad, by the way, and I'm not so crazy about the photo, except I love the plastic on the furniture, which I just like lives on in infamy in my mind. And we won't get into that one, but I think we all know what that felt like on a sweaty summer day. So that's my dad, that's my brother, and that's me, obviously, the little baby. To give you a little geometry, since this is an engineering poem, and I was designing bridges at the time, there's a bridge in Miami that when you're going from east to west is like the highest point in Miami, and we call it Mount Miami. Miami's flat as a pancake, as you know. And it's this wonderful vista when you get to the apex of that bridge, and you see to the left are all the, what we call the Civic Center, where all the hospitals are, and to the right is this sort of wonderful view of the skyline, and below all that is sort of all this, ranch-style homes and the rooftops and the greenery. And so that's the landscape and the sighting of this poem. And it's a place I used to drive through every day to go to work. Papa's Bridge. Morning, driving west again, away from the sun rising in the slit of the rearview mirror. As I climb on concrete and steel bent into a bridge, arcing with all its parabolic Y squared splendor, I rise to meet the shimmering faces of buildings above treetops meshed into a calico of greens, forgetting the river below runs, insists on running and scouring the earth, moving it, grain by grain. And if only for a few inclined seconds every morning, I am 12 years old again, with my father standing at the 10th floor window of his hospital room, gazing at the same bridge like a mammoth bone aching with the gravity of its own dense weight. The glass dosed by a tepid light reviving the city as I watched and read him sleeping, wondering if he could even dream in such dreamless white. Was he flying? Was he falling? Was he flying? Was he falling? Who was he? Who was I underneath his eyelids, flitting like the birds across rooftops, the early morning stars wasting away, the rush hour cars pushing through the avenues like the tiny blood cells through his vein, the ivy spiraling down like a string of clear licorice feeding his forearm, bruised pearl and lavender, colors of the morning haze, and the pills on his tongue. The stitches healed while the room kept sterile with the usual silence between us. For 3 days, I served him water or juice in wilting paper cups, flipped through muted soap operas and game shows, filled out the menu cards stamped bland diet. For 3 nights, I wedged flat, strange pillows around his bed, his body, shaped like a fallen S, mortared in place by layers of stiff percale. When he was ordered to walk, I took his hand. Together, we stepped to the window, and he spoke. Mijo, someday you'll know how to build bridges like that. Today, I cross this city, this bridge again, still spanning the silent distance between us with the memory of a father and a son holding hands and secretly in love. Thank you. This will make sense in a minute. You can tell I really loved baseball, right? And the cat, you can make the metaphor going on what the poem's going to happen right now. It's interesting because there's something as the first gay, openly gay man. If I wasn't open by the time they announced it, I don't know what would have happened. But the idea is that for me is that as a gay man, there's another search for home. There's a search for home in the figurative sense of that place that you feel safe and that who you can be, who you are. And that is also sort of figures into my psyche and my work and what that means. That place where I can finally be and I can sit in the couch and say, this is who I am. And so I wanted to introduce this poem a little bit. It deals with some of that yearning from childhood of always feeling like there was no home where I belonged, not only in terms of culturally or nationally, but in terms as a gay man. Where was that place where I was going to belong? And what's interesting too is that those two things also collide and intersect. And I have this sense of what is called a cultural sexuality. So that it's not, coming out stories are not the same. They're as varied as anybody's stories. It's not the same thing to be a little Cuban gay fat kid I wasn't too fat then, growing up in Miami behind a bowling alley in a suburb versus some Asian American gay kid who grew up in Topeka, Kansas behind a dry cleaner. And the idea that our stories are all intertwined again. And I couldn't quite figure out how to write about my sexuality till I figured that out, and then enter my grandmother, who was extremely homophobic and psychologically and verbally abusive woman, who was actually the life of the party, actually. But at home, it was another story. But she was also completely xenophobic, so that anything that was culturally odd was also gay. She equated these two things. So we're talking things like Fruit Loops, we're gay. Cub Scouts, we're gay. She wasn't far off on that one, but anything that she couldn't quite fathom culturally was, I had very little wiggle room at that moment. So here's a poem written in the voice of my grandmother, which is trying to capture the humor of that moment and the humor of her audacity and the things that she says, that she used to say, but also that sense of cultural sexuality, and also, of course, the child longing to be and belong and be embraced and loved. As I've read this poem throughout the country, though, and this is what I love about poetry, that it also transcends its own story. Everybody has someone like my grandmother in their family. They always have that, that relative that means well, that's like, oh, you look good. How much weight did you lose, Or like, I love what you did with your hair. What, Clairol, what is that one? Like, just someone who's always means well, but is like constantly cutting you up. Anyway, this is a poem written in her voice, which I thought it was a way of getting back with her, but it's a whimsical poem. And I thought, what was the point of becoming a poet in the first place? I still can't get even with her, so here we go. Queer theory according to my grandmother. Never drink your soda with a straw. Men don't use straws. Milkshakes? Bueno, maybe. Stop buying your mother's Avon catalog and the men's underwear in those Sears flyers. I've seen you. Stay out of her Tupperware parties and perfume bottles. Don't let her kiss you. She kisses you much too much. Avoid hugging men, but if you must, pat them real hard on the back, even if it's your father. Must you keep that cat? Don't pet him so much. Ay, mijo, why don't you like dogs? Never play house, even if you're the husband. And quit hanging out with that Henry kid. He's too pale. And I don't care what you call them, those G.I. Joes of his are dolls. Don't draw rainbows or flowers or sunsets. I've seen you. Don't draw at all. No coloring books either. Put away your crayons, those Play-Dohs, those Legos. Where are your Hot Wheels, your laser gun, and handcuffs? Those knives I gave you for Christmas. Never fly a kite or roller skate, but light all the firecrackers you want, kill all the lizards you can, cut up worms, and feed them to that cat of yours. Don't sit Indian style with your legs crossed. You're no Indio. Stop click-clacking your sandals. You're no Tropicana chorus girl. And for God's sake, mijo, never, ever pee sitting down. I've seen you. Never take a bubble bath or wash your hair with shampoo. Shampoo is for women. So is conditioner, so is el mousse, so is hand lotion. Never file your nails or blow dry your hair. Go to the barber shop with your grandfather. You're not unisex, are you? Stay out of the kitchen. Los hombres don't cook, they eat. Eat anything you want except deviled eggs, blow pops, croissants, bagels? Maybe. Cucumber sandwiches or esos petit fours. Don't watch Bewitched or I Dream of Jeannie. Don't stare at the $6 million man. I've seen you. Never dance alone in your room. Donna Summer, Barry Manilow, the Captain, Antonio, Bette Midler in all musicals, forbidden. Posters of kittens, Star Wars, or the Eiffel Tower, forbidden. Those fancy books on architecture and art, I threw them in the trash. No, you can't wear cologne or puka shells, and I better not catch you in clogs. If I see you in a ponytail, I'm cutting it off. Not sure what she meant by that, but I wanted to end the poem there at one moment, but anyway. Gay. What? You can't pierce your ear left or right side. I don't care. You will not look like a goddamn queer. I've seen you. Even though I know you are one. Thank you. So naturally, that next step in like, where am I from, where do I belong, where am I Cuban, what's going on, the next step was to go to Cuba. And it was a magical experience. It was something that was like just sort of filling in a lot of blanks. And a lot of times I say I returned to Cuba. I still say that to this day because it felt like I was going back to Cuba because of all the stories, I felt like I'd been there in some way. So this is sort of a comical poem that also has sort of a mythic element to it. How this poem began is one of the weirdest poem beginnings I've ever had. But I was reading Genesis from the Bible, and a friend of mine told me, los cubanos se creen que son el ombligo del mundo, which literally means like Cubans think they're the belly button of the world. And I had to give her I had to give her a certain, yeah, kind of. And I started really thinking about that. And Cubans, in Miami at least, and have a little bit of a stereotype for being very, very grandiose and very all about, I'm Cuban, and it's all about being Cuban. And I realized that part of that is the exile mentality. It is this idea of preserving your culture, because psychologically, you want to take that back exactly as you brought it. You want to take it back. So it's this over self-celebratory sense of life and culture. So I was reading, again, in the story of creation, and I thought, well, what if a Cuban would have written the story of creation? And this was what it would sound like. And it was kind of playing on my own stereotype as of my Cuban community. Of course, when you read this to a Cuban audience, they're like, yes, you know? But it's all tongue-in-cheek. And I'll give you an epilogue to this. The final joke on this was on me. Anyway, this is part of my first trip to Cuba, which, you know, the whole family, it was so amazing, like filling in all the blanks. And so this is also symbolically a genesis into this other world, into the return to that promised land, that paradise, that Eden that we had left. It's called Havanasis, a play, of course, on Genesis. In the beginning, before God created Cuba, the earth was chaos, empty of form and without music. The Spirit of God stirred over the dark tropical waters, and God said, "Let there be music." And a soft conga began a 1-2 beat in the background of the chaos. Then God called up Yemaya and said, "Let the waters under heaven amass together and let dry land appear." It was done. God called the fertile red earth Cuba and the amassed waters the Caribbean. And God saw this was good, tapping his foot to the conga beat. Then God said, "Let the earth sprout papaya and cocoa and white cocoa flesh, malanga roots and mangoes in all shades of gold and amber. Let there be tobacco and cafe and sugar for the cafe. Let there be rum. Let there be waving plantains and guayabas and everything tropical-like." God saw this was good. Then he fashioned palm trees, his pièces de résistance. Then God said, "Let there be a moon and stars to light the nights over Club Tropicana, and a sun for 365 days of the year." God saw this was good. He called the night nightlife. The day he called paradise. Then God said, "Let there be fish and fowl of every kind." And there was spicy shrimp enchilado, chicken fricassé, codfish bacalao, and fritters. But he wanted something more exciting and said, "Enough. Let there be pork." And there was pork, deep fried, whole roasted, pork rinds and sausage. He fashioned goats, used their skins for bongos and batus. He made claves and marangas and every kind of percussion instrument known to man. Then, out of a lump of red clay, he made a taíno and set him in a city he called Havana. Then he said, "It is not good that taíno be alone. Let me make him helpmates." And so God created La Mulata to dance guaguancó and song with taíno, the Guajiro to cultivate his land and his folklore, Cachita, the sorceress, to strike the rhythm of his music, and a poet to work the verses of their paradise. God gave them dominion over all the creatures and musical instruments, and said unto them, "Be fruitful and multiply. Eat pork, drink rum, make music and dance." On the seventh day, God rested from the labors of his creation. He smiled upon the celebration and listened to their music. Thank you. The epilogue to that poem is that I read that poem with a poet named Ed. Oh my God, I'm going to skip it. I just want to say Shapiro. I think it's Edward Hirsch, sorry, at Bread Loaf, which is this fancy writing place. And he read right after me, and he said, I have got to say this because my good Jewish mother would never forgive me if I did not say that God did not create pork. And so the joke was on me because I was caught in the same sort of virtual world, not ever really realizing the audacity of a Judeo God telling them to eat pork and dance. Anyway, I went to Cuba. Cuba was amazing, as I said. It was this storybook. Best I can describe it as sort of this pop-up storybook, like a kid, where suddenly your life comes to 3D and there's all these blank spaces are filled in. But the flip side of that was that it wasn't home. In a way, I realized that it wasn't a time machine, and even though Cuba, the cars are still from the 1950s, and it adds to the illusion of that sense of being back home, it wasn't my parents' Cuba. And it was a place that I couldn't live in either because legally I can't. So I went about the world sort of just moved to New England and thought, well, maybe I'll find the Brady Bunch there. Maybe me and Martha Stewart will do arts and crafts on Tuesdays. Maybe there'll be sleigh rides in the snow. That, of course, did not work out. And so I became sort of an avid traveler, again, with those same questions of home and belonging, where's place, and what does that look like, and what does that feel like, sort of like on a much larger spectrum. And I realized in that sort of period in my life that this idea, again, of home is something pretty universal. I would imagine that all of us are guilty of this. I was even doing it today, looking at the real estate ads in Aspen, and I thought the prices were reasonable, but we all go to these places. Part of the hidden agenda of vacationing is always sort of that we're always trying to get back to that Eden, to that Shangri-La, to that promised land. It's even in our it's in our literature. It's in all our faiths. It's in even our pop songs. Country Road, Take Me Home, and so. This poem is sort of a whimsical look at that perpetual hope that we have of always finding that perfect place. And I met someone yesterday who's actually from Malta, which I'm slightly scared to read this poem now, but this is sort of a whimsical, again, this idea of if only. If only I moved to Brazil, or if I moved to Sao Paulo, all our problems will go away, right? And it's called We're Not Going to Malta, and I'll try to do my best Norwegian accent on this. We're not going to Malta because the winds are too strong, our captain announces, his voice like an oracle coming through the loudspeakers in every lounge and hall, as if the ship itself were speaking. We're not going to Malta, an enchanting island country 50 miles from Sicily, according to the brochure of the tour we're not taking. But what if we did go to Malta? What if, as we were escorted on foot through the silent city of Medea, the walls begin speaking to me? And after we stop a few minutes to admire the impressive architecture, I feel Malta could be the place for me. What if, as we stroll the bastions to admire the panoramic harbor and stunning countryside, I dream of buying a little Maltese farm, raising Maltese horses in the green Maltese hills? What if, after we see the cathedral in Mosta, saved by a miracle, I believe that Malta itself is a miracle? And before I'm transported back to the pier with a complimentary beverage, I'm struck with Malta fever. Discover I'm very Maltese indeed, and decide I must return to Malta, learn to speak Maltese with an English or Spanish accent, work as a Maltese professor of English at the University of Malta, and teach a course on the Maltese falcon. Or what if, when we stop at a factory to shop for famous Maltese ware, I discover that making Maltese crosses is my true passion. Yes, I get a Maltese cat and a Maltese dog, make Maltese friends, drink malted milk, join the Knights of Malta, and be happy for the rest of my Maltesian life. But we're not going to Malta. Malta is drifting past us, or we are drifting past it. An amorphous hump of green and brown bobbing in the portholes with the horizon as the ship heaves over whitecaps, wisping into rainbows for just a moment, then dissolving back into the sea. I forgot to show them. I forgot to show the Malta slide, but Malta, and this might be the Cuban connection, Malta is actually this wonderful Latino, very Cuban actually, drink. And I have not done the research from it, but Malta, much like Cuba, got around for a small island. Maltese crosses, Maltese dogs, they did a lot. So I just found this comical in the sense of like, maybe there's a connection in there. So anyway, Malta didn't work out. New England didn't work out. Cuba didn't work out. So I said, let's go back to Miami. Let's go back to South Florida, this place that is the only place that understands this animal named Richard Blanco, this idea of living, again, between those two imaginary worlds. And of course, that didn't work out either. The old adage of you can't go back home. And that's what this poem is about. A little bit of background on that. I took my partner Mark to Marco Island on the west coast of Florida. And it was a place that we used to vacation a lot of as kids. It was a poor man's vacation, $75 for the week, air conditioner on the fritz, the whole 9 yards. And I took him back 30 years or so later, thinking, of course, nothing had changed because nobody gave me the memo or asked my permission to change or erase my memories. And I wrote this ranting poem, and I found myself caught in the same sort of psychological space as my parents when they used to talk about Cuba. And I realized how universal their experience was, that it's happening to me now. This idea that we can't hold on to things, the idea that mortality, that time moves on, we're victims of history, things move on. And it doesn't make us feel any better, but that's what this poem is sort of aiming at. And as I've read this poem throughout the country, I realize everybody has their figurative Gulf Motel. That one place in your life, usually from childhood, but not necessarily, you just don't want anyone to ever mess with. And some of us are lucky that that stays the same. This wasn't the case in this poem. Looking for the Gulf Motel, Marco Island, Florida. There should be nothing here I don't remember. The Gulf Motel with mermaid lampposts and ship's wheel in the lobby should still be rising out of the sand like a cake decoration. My brother and I should still be pretending we don't know our parents, embarrassing us as they roll the luggage cart past the front desk, loaded with our scruffy suitcases, 24 loaves of Cuban bread, brown bags bulging with enough mangoes to last the entire week, our espresso pot, the pressure cooker, and a pork roast reeking garlic through the marble lobby. All because, mijo, we can't afford to eat out. Not even on vacation. Only 2 hours from our home in Miami, but far enough away to be thrilled by the whiter sands on the west coast of Florida, where I should still be, for the first time, watching the sun set instead of rise over the ocean. There should be nothing here. I don't remember. My mother should still be in the kitchenette of the Gulf Motel, her daisy sandals from Kmart squeaking across the linoleum, still gorgeous in her teal swimsuit and amber earrings, stirring a pot of arroz con pollo, adding sprinkles of onion powder and dollops of tomato sauce. My father should still be in a terry cloth jacket, smoking, clinking a glass of amber whiskey in the amber sunset at the Gulf Motel, watching us dive into the pool, two sons he'll never see grow into men who will be proud of him. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My brother and I should still be playing parcheesi. My father should still be alive, slow dancing with my mother on the sliding glass balcony of the Gulf Motel. No music, only the waves keeping time. A song only their minds hear 10,000 nights back to their life in Cuba. My mother's face should still be resting against his bare chest, like the moon resting on the sea and the stars. The stars should still be turning around them. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My brother should still be 13, sneaking rum in the bathroom, sculpting naked women from sand. And I should still be 8 years old, dazzled by seashells and how many seconds I can hold my breath underwater. But I'm not. I'm 38, driving up Collier Boulevard, looking for the Gulf Motel, for everything that should still be, but isn't. I want to blame the condos, their shadows for ruining the beach and my past. I want to chase the snowbirds away with their tacky McMansions and yachts. I want to turn the golf courses back into mangroves. I want to find the Gulf Motel exactly as it was and pretend for just a moment that nothing I've lost is lost. Thank you. I'm going to give you a choice in the interest of time. We can either hear a poem about Mark or a poem about skiing and my lack of ability. Okay, Mark. So, this is Mark. That's not me skiing. I can't ski. Anyway, we ended up back in Maine, as some of the story goes, and the idea being, again, sort of searching this place for home, and the idea that love actually is the real home, and having a partner really makes a difference, and you can almost live anywhere kind of thing, even in Maine, which is cold. But I wanted to share a poem from Maine because, as you can see, the landscapes are familiar to where we are here today. And this poem is, again, somewhat of a comical or whimsical poem. It started with this idea that there's two kinds of people in a relationship. There's those that call and those that never call. And Mark is the kind that never calls. And so, despite the title of this poem, which is called Killing Mark, it is a love poem. But it deals with two things. One is, those moments where you're like, oh shit, I'm my mother again. I remember my mother, wading through the streets of our suburb like Ophelia in her curlers because we were 10 minutes past curfew. Just because she was waiting for the ambulance to come or the police car. And I do this to Mark all the time. And the other thing, which was surprising to me, I thought this was a very gay poem. And this is obviously with my relationship with Mark. And it's like Bethel's, my hometown now, Bethel's favorite poem. And so you have lumberjacks screaming like, read Killing Mark. And like, it was an incredible surprise to realize that at the end of the day, people realize that relationships are relationships, marriages are marriages. And it gave me great hope in the sense of that we're getting there. We're understanding this. Even in a small rural town in Maine, people understand our relationship and understand and can relate to their own relationship. So anyway, this is called Killing Mark. This happens about once a week. His plane went down over Los Angeles last week again. Or was it Long Island? Boxer shorts, his hair gel, toothbrush, washed up on the shores of New Haven, but his body never recovered, I feared. Monday, he cut off his leg chainsawing, bled to death slowly while I was shopping for a new lamp. He never heard my messages on his cell phone. Where are you? Call me. I told him to be careful. He never listens. Tonight, 15 minutes late, I'm sure he's hit a moose on Route 26. But maybe he survived. Someone from the hospital will call me, give me his room number. I'll bring pajamas, some magazines. 5:25. Still no phone call. Voicemail full. I turn on the news, wait for the report. Flashes of moose blood, his car mangled, as I buzz around the bedroom, dusting the furniture and sorting the sock drawer again. Did someone knock? I'm expecting the sheriff by 6 o'clock. Mr. Blanco, he'll say. I'm afraid, he'll say. And hand me a Ziploc with his wallet, his sunglasses, his wristwatch. I'll invite him in, make some coffee. 6:25, I'll have to call his mom, explain, arrange to fly the body back home. Do I have enough garbage bags for his clothes? I should keep his ties, but his shoes? Oh yeah, order flowers, roses, red or white. By 7:30, I'm taking mental notes for his eulogy, suddenly adoring all I've hated, 10 years worth of nose hairs in the sink, of lost car keys, of chewing too loudly and hogging the bed sheets, when Joey, our dog, yowls, ears to the sound of footsteps up the drive, and darts to the doorway. I follow him with a scowl. Where the hell were you? You couldn't call, could you? Translation, I die each time I kill you.
I'm going to die soon, just in terms of getting us to dinner.
Oh, okay. All right.
So I think we're going to probably adjourn unless there's, maybe one more that kind of wraps, is a summy thing.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I'll just read the inaugural poem and we're done.
That sounds great. That'd be a great send-off.
So, there's Mark. Well, here's the chute, the famous chute where you go down through. Talk about all cojones at this point. And then you see that. To be very brief, why I've given you all this backdrop is this whole idea of search of home, identity, where I belong. To be very brief, the greatest gift of the inauguration was to actually finally find a home. The acceptance of the idea of who I was, reading that poem to America, for America, that made me question all these other things about everything that I was questioning, and the idea that I was home all along. And that my story, my mother's story, your story, all of our stories are the American story. And it was a moment of such great celebration to be able to be accepted in that way. And it was the most powerful moment of that inauguration. Part of the reason I didn't freak out. It was a very emotional moment. So here's the poem. One today. One sun rose on us today, kindled over our shores, peeking over the Smokies, greeting the faces of the Great Lakes, spreading a simple truth across the Great Plains, then charging over the Rockies. One light, waking up rooftops, under each one a story told by our silent gestures, moving behind windows. My face, your face, millions of faces in morning's mirrors, yawning to life, crescendoing into our day. Pencil yellow school buses, the rhythm of traffic lights, fruit stands, apples, limes, and oranges arrayed like rainbows begging our praise. Silver trucks heavy with oil or paper, bricks or milk, teeming over highways alongside us, on our way to clean tables, read ledgers, or save lives, to teach geometry or ring up groceries as my mother did for 20 years, so I could write this poem for us today. All of us. As vital as the one light we move through. The same light on blackboards with lessons for the day. Equations to solve or history to question. Atoms imagined. The I have a dream. We keep dreaming. Or the impossible vocabulary of sorrow that won't explain the empty deaths of 20 children marked absent today and forever. Many prayers, but one light, breathing color into stained glass windows, life into the faces of bronze statues, warmth onto the steps of our museums and park benches as mothers watch their children slide into the day. One ground, our ground, rooting us to every stalk of corn, every head of wheat sown by sweat and hands, hands gleaning coal or planting windmills in deserts and hilltops that keep us warm, hands digging trenches, routing pipes and cables, hands as worn as my father's cutting sugarcane so my brother and I could have books and shoes. The dust of our farms and deserts, our cities and plains, mingled by one wind, our breath. Breathe. Hear it through the day's gorgeous din of honking cabs, buses launching down avenues, the symphony of footsteps, guitars, and screeching subways, the unexpected songbird on your clothesline. Hear squeaky playground swings, trains whistling or whispers across cafe tables. Hear the doors we open for each other all day, saying hello, shalom, buongiorno, howdy, namaste, or buenos dias, in the language my mother taught me. In every language spoken into one wind carrying our lives without prejudice, as these words break from my lips. One sky. Since the Appalachians and Sierras claimed their majesty, and the Mississippi and Colorado worked their way to the sea. Thank the work of our hands, weaving steel into bridges, finishing one more report for the boss on time, stitching another wound or uniform. The first brushstroke on a portrait or the last floor on the Freedom Tower, jutting into a sky that yields to our resilience. One sky toward which we sometimes lift our eyes, tired from work. Some days guessing at the weather of our lives, some days giving thanks for a love that loves you back. Sometimes praising a mother who knew how to give, or forgiving a father who couldn't give what you wanted. And so we head home, through the gloss of rain, or weight of snow, or the plum blush of dusk, but always, always home. Always under one sky, our sky, and always one moon. Like a silent drum tapping on every rooftop and every window of one country. All of us facing the stars and hope, a new constellation, waiting for us to map it, waiting for us to name it together. Thank you. Thanks, guys. You're welcome. Thank you.
The poem's a beautiful gift to all of us. Thank you so much, and thank you for being here tonight. And join us again on February 8th for Nick Flynn and Danny Shapiro. Thanks so much, Richard, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.